All right, what's up? What's up? What's happening? Back with another video. I told y'all we was going to be touching on this one today. Definitely going to be looking at Bacon's Rebellion. This is going to be a little lengthy. I'm not going to lie to you. Um, but I think it's worth it in the end. It's definitely going to be worth it. Uh, I don't want to talk too much on it. I just want to get right into it. But a couple things. Credit to the content creators. They're going to be listed down in the description. Don't be afraid to say what's up to the Cash App. Much appreciated. And hit the follow button on my Instagram at the.o.m.experience. And I'm on YouTube, of course. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Ask me some questions. DM me questions on the Instagram. And also, I definitely would prefer if you DM me questions through email, and if you have any videos you want me to react to or give my opinion on or to analyze, definitely send it in through the email. Make sure you link the video in which you're referencing, and then I could put it up here and whatnot. But yeah, without further ado, we're going to get into one video just to give a little brief history on what it is we're going to be talking about, and then we're going to get into another video in which I actually already watched, but I think it's pretty good. I haven't watched it. I only watched it once, and it was a couple weeks ago, so it will definitely be a refresher for me. Like I said, they're going to be lengthy. This whole thing is going to be lengthy. I'm going to be talking in the middle of it, just breaking it down how all these things still play into today, and how you have to be able to identify pieces of information from yesterday that may not be important or that may be important, and how to intertwine that into tomorrow. But without further ado, let's get into it. Yeah. hmm I'm here. All right.
The expansion of one group as they conquer and enslave their neighbors. But in this context, race was more or less incidental. The Egyptians, Romans, Greeks, and even Native Americans each enslaved a variety of different people, but no one particular racial group was specifically targeted or singled out for slave status. The advent of the Atlantic slave trade brought about a radical transformation in which race became the defining factor in determining who was slave and who was free. Additionally, the era of the Atlantic slave trade no longer functioned as a means to assimilate a population, but to specifically single out a population. Slave status could now be passed down to one's children and one's children's children, and so on. In 1619...
Now, I also want to add in a caveat. It didn't matter. That was always a thing. Your children, again, paying for the sins of the parent. Well before this, even with the Barbary slave trade, long before that, even with the Mongols, Romans, like you mentioned, even the Egyptians, if your parent was a slave or from another nation and they didn't get killed in battle, they became a slave, more than likely your child became a slave too, or an indentured servant. I think he's going to break it down in this. I'm not too sure. I hope so. But yeah, I just wanted to get that, a little bit more clarified. And I also want to add in too, I would love to know this guy's genetic makeup, because if that's a perm, that is a grave mistake. Okay, that was off topic, but we're going to get into it.
The English warship White Lion entered Point Comfort in the English colony of Jamestown, which eventually was absorbed into the colony of Virginia. They arrived with a cargo that included some 20 captured Africans. The African captives began their hellish journey along with some 350 others who had been kidnapped from their present-day villages in Angola and forced onto a Portuguese slave ship. By the time they arrived in Veracruz, Mexico, only 147, less than half, had survived the Middle Passage. But their ordeal was just beginning. The survivors were then stolen and divided amongst English pirates, among whom around 20 were taken to Jamestown Colony on August 20th, 1619, where they were traded for food. There's been much debate over the status of those African arrivals. Did they arrive as slaves or indentured servants? Their status wasn't clear. The main reason for the lack of clarity here is that in the early 1600s, slavery had no clearly defined legal definition. It was an ambiguous term for an institution that was not yet fully developed conceptually. As such, there was little distinction between slaves and indentured servants. Consistent with a system of slavery and servitude throughout human history, ethnic European servants of the Old World consisted of poor and conquered people. The notion of race had not yet developed as a factor in this form of servitude in the early colonial American history. Prior to the early 1600s,
Pay attention to this part. Pay attention. This is actually, oh, he's getting on to what I had already previously mentioned, but he's adding some more information in. This is good.
racial terms such as white and black had little social meaning. In fact, as
He's absolutely right. People didn't identify as color, they identified as their nation. So let me put this in perspective. When I first went to college, I had this classmate named Vishnu. Now, Vishnu was one of his names out of 16 names. And when I asked him to break it down for me, he took the time, which I was grateful for. It was me and a couple others, but I don't think they actually cared to remember. I was the only one asking questions here. Um, and when he wrote down his whole name, and I'm like, yo, bro, why is your name so long? It was like, well, most of this is just paying homage to my bloodline and where I come from. And I was like, well, why? So how he broke it down is this: you pay homage to your bloodline so people know what class you come from, right? And he was saying how in India they have the social classes, which they're super prevalent and open about. America, we try to hide that, but that's for more reasons later to come. Um, but they're more than open and honest about their social classes. In India, so your name denotes what social class you come from, and then on top of it, the location. So where in India you pay homage to that too. And I personally adopted that. That's how I also came up with the name Elm City Javon, because in, even though this is, you could say America is not a country, it's a business. How it's run is more like a business. The time frame in which this physical body is, moving around on this planet, I was born in the Elm City, New Haven, aka New Haven, Connecticut. All right, so that's just to pay homage and mark in time in which I lived my life. And that's one of those things that's also paying homage to the geographical frequencies, uh, because planets themselves have their own magnetic frequencies and whatnot, and that has a consequence in the universe that has its own reactions that we may or may not be acted on and acted upon. So, it was a very great conversation. But yeah, he's absolutely right. Terms black, white, green, gray, that wasn't how you identified people. There was a higher level of intellect. Um, and it's not to say we don't have a higher level of intellect. The intent was just a lot different as we go further back in time. So yeah, let's get back into this.
As we saw in a previous episode, the concept of race is a relatively recent phenomenon in human history, emerging only within the past 400 years. During the period that predated social constructs of blackness and whiteness as we understand them today, Europe had a turbulent history of war, conquest, and enslavement going all the way back to Roman times. In other words, before slavery became racially based, Europeans essentially enslaved other Europeans. In fact, the very
Now, I also want to preface this too, because I don't want anybody of European descent, aka my white people, because I love my white people, I love my rednecks. I don't say that out of, you know, uh, poor intent. I say it, because you are a specific branch of people. I say that with love. Uh, there was a time called the Dark Ages, and the Dark Ages referred to Europe and how just everything was so poor, the behavior, the way of life, even the cleanliness was at an all-time low. And it was Africans or descendants of Africans, aka Moors, that helped ascend Europe out of the Dark Ages. But remember, what's being practiced today, somewhere down the line, is a derivative of what was taught. So we can also say, the enslavement of what they were doing then, to their own people back then, was taught by the Africans and the Moors way back then. So now you have to sit there and say, okay, well, what was the intent of this, and how was that actually being practiced? That is a much larger and tougher question to answer because we're so far down the line. We'll never truly know. We can only speculate analyze and then come to a popular consensus. However, we can certainly say that seeing how things have transpired throughout time and where we are today, there certainly was a foundational practice of servitude of sorts.
The word slave originates from the Holy Roman Empire's conquest and enslavement of Slavic peoples in the 9th century. The relationship between Europe's various warring groups remained turbulent into the fairly recent past. In fact, England's first venture into the colonial era didn't take place in Africa nor the Americas, but in Ireland. It was there that England developed the concept of a plantation colony, and that concept would be extended throughout an empire that would eventually include Africa.
I know I'm stopping a lot, but there's a lot of information here. It's a short video, but I also want to add this in. There's a reason why that piece of information is very important, because America today, if you're new melanated of sorts, and new melanated meaning of lighter pigmentation, you can automatically be considered white within the U.S. Census Bureau, and that's how sometimes you'll be classified on behalf of the United States. However, even to Europeans, when you come from, again, certain bodies of land, you're still looked down upon. So when we had Irish immigrants coming over, Irish were looked at as less than black people, and black people knew this, even down to the Italians. And when I say black people, I say that lightly, really just the melanated people that were here already, and those that were brought over either from Africa or from Southern America in the Southern Islands into what is now North America mainland. Very, very, very important piece of context necessary to keep in mind for this. I hope that wasn't muted. Oh well.
Australia, India, and other parts of Asia, and of course, the Americas. The English conquest and colonization of the Irish brought with it centuries of hostility between England and Ireland. Additionally, with England's harsh colonial treatment of its Irish subjects, an ideology of supremacy soon developed that would later be applied to other groups as a justification for English domination over its colonial subjects. Edmund S. Morgan, author of American Slavery, American Freedom, The Ordeal of Colonial Virginia, writes that, in the eyes of the English, the Irish were clearly the wrong kind of people. In the English view, they were barbarous, only nominally Christian, and generally intractable.
When life happens, healthcare.gov is here.
I mean, one moment. All right, and we are back. Let me bring this back for about 5 seconds.
They were barbarous, only nominally Christian, and generally intractable. The English view of superiority over their subjects accompanied colonial policies guided by the economic principle of mercantilism. Mercantilism is the underlying principle that colonies exist solely for the benefit of the mother country. What the English needed from its colonial subjects in Ireland was wool for clothing, and it was England's need for wool that brought about a colonial policy known as the enclosure movement. So, while the way in which the Irish organized their land had worked for them for countless generations prior to English colonization, colonization transformed Irish society by enclosing the old Irish manners that used to form the basis of food production to promote the herding of sheep. Remember here that the concept of mercantilism dictates that colonies exist solely for the benefit of the mother country, so the enclosure movement was never intended to be for the benefit of the Irish. The process of enclosure, accompanied by force, resistance, and bloodshed, pushed the Irish off their ancestral homelands. They then flooded the streets of London, jobless and homeless, where they were arrested wholesale and imprisoned as vagrants. From their prison cells, their debts to society were purchased in exchange for 7 years of indentured servitude in the Americas. Some historians, such as Professor Ron Takaki, author of A Different Mirror, A Multicultural History of the United States, have argued that the export of these Irish immigrants was coercive at best. But Dr. Takaki goes as far as to refer to their forced migration as a wholesale kidnapping. After they were purchased for 7 years of service, they were crammed into ships headed for the Americas, on a voyage in which they were subject to dysentery, pregnant women suffered miscarriage, and many died horrible deaths en route. If the experience of the poor white and Irish indentured servants sounds familiar, it should. The similarity between their experience and that of African captives of the Atlantic slave trade wasn't lost on the Irish. They recognized early on that while they didn't arrive on the same boat as the Africans, they arrived on a boat that looked like, felt like, and smelled much like the boats that the Africans arrived on.
Yep.
Court records of the period are rife with instances of collaboration between blacks, poor ethnic European, and Irish indentured servants. It wasn't uncommon for blacks and whites to run away and conspire in rebellions together. As Howard Zinn,
and that is key. See, so now when you have a unity where a shallow identity doesn't play in, that means there's something fundamental there that is holding a bond, that is creating a bond. This is where you get like the differences of ionic, covalent, and metallic bonds. Some bonds are stronger than others, and then it gets even deeper when you have certain type of bonds between certain type of elements, whether it be carbon bonding, hydrogen bonding, and so on and so forth. And it's not to say, or let me put it like this, if I'm capable of explaining it to you that way, there was certainly someone, if we're going to work off the ideology of our ancestors and elders were just as, if not smarter than us, meaning that if we have people that made poor decisions today, we have people way back when that made poor decisions because they're just as intelligent as us. We're not even going to, downgrade them in any sort of way. But when you see someone like me that's capable of breaking this down, or somebody else that's capable of understanding this and explaining this, then that means there's somebody way back when that also understood this too in live time.
notes in A People's History of the United States, the very fact that laws had to be passed to forbid such relations indicates the strength of that tendency. A 1661 law was passed in Virginia that in case any English servant shall run away in the company of Negroes, he should have to give a special service of extra years to the master of the runaway Negro.
All right. I think that's super important because this is where we start seeing laws on, words on paper being put into effect. I kind of would like to keep going. Let's jump into the next video. All right. Awesome. And you know what? Let's just get straight into it. We're not even going to wait.
The work to separate you and me by color is on purpose. It was strategic, and it had a starting point. Because the true division is really not about color. It is about money and power. You might have these moments.
What she said is very important, and a lot of people miss this. What does war mean? And this is where, and I'm going to break this down in other videos. Again, all of this is prerequisite information that you need to be able to start to understand how the physical world, or this 1% of the energy spectrum in which we are being able to ingest, comprehend, and critically decipher, is expressing itself to us. Let's just get into it. Let's get into it. There will be time for that. There'll be time.
In life, I know I definitely have, where I'm like, I look at this date and I'm like, after this date, things totally changed. It was
Okay, you know what? I'm gonna say it anyway. My bad. After a while, when you start studying this information, you then end up seeing you have to study the language as well, because the language in which humans spoke prior to today was a lot more complex, a lot more intentional, and that's because it's almost a law. After a while, as a species, for us, when we figure out how to do something better, we end up taking a faster route to get it done. We want more efficiency. So you take word. So for example, in the English language, we have the phrase "going to." Throughout time, and even now, "going to" has turned into "gonna." And now it's colloquially acceptable, and eventually throughout time, if this word is being used more and more in conversation, and as we start to see it put down on paper, it will end up becoming a part of our diction. And then that's where you get dictionaries and whole meanings and all of that whatnot, and definitions and whatnot.
It was everything before that date, everything after that date, and we can look at Bacon's Rebellion that way. Hi, I'm Danielle Romero. Thank you so much for being with me here on my channel, where we talk about American history.
I just want to get straight into it. Content creator information will be down below in the description.
Were intended to be used. They were meant to bring where it came from. Now, before we get into the history of this is not to imply that there are no current issues regarding color or race or ethnicity, and that if we could just talk about this history, it would all go away. But it does highlight that at the nation's outset, before America became America, division was strategically implemented to prevent unity among the population. We must understand that when we use these terms right now to create conflict and division and discord, you are using the terms exactly how they were intended to be used. They were meant to bring division. It was meant to bring discord. Why? Bacon's Rebellion and the laws that etched black and white into our nation's psyche. These were tools of the rich elite to sow discord among us. Why do you think we aren't?
Now, I've seen a video not too long ago saying how, Bacon's Rebellion is coming alive again, Bacon's Will is coming alive again, things of that nature. I don't necessarily want to put it as that. However, I do in a couple of videos, and I'm letting you know, I will find it, because there was there's certain images and graphs that I think we need to be able to see, especially now that we have this technology where we can communicate all over the world. We have AI, which is growing at a rapid pace. We have translators, so now the language barrier is changing and whatnot. Was it the Tower of Babylon? The Tower of Babel or Babylon is no longer as much an issue, or can be as much as an issue as it once was. We have a great opportunity on our hands here, and what could potentially become a golden age. However, if it's not done with care, when things aren't done with care, you get careless outcomes, for lack of better terminology. What she touched on is very important. When it talks about the elite class and whatnot, that is highly important. We know it exists because every time you turn on your news media, it's talking about the elite class, the establishment, even down to our podcast today, or our channels on YouTube and other social media platforms are talking about the establishment and things of that nature. And it's almost, I don't want to get too deep into it right now. I want to stay on topic, but it does become a complex conversation where it's like, if you went out snowboarding, you turn around and you see a giant snowball rolling behind you, do you want to stop the snowball, or do what you can to turn the snowball into a direction that is controlled and maintainable? And then if it's done with care, you can sit back and marvel once it stops rolling, or you're out of the way from the blast zone.
aren't allowed to talk about this? Why do you think my channel has been flagged from here to high heaven multiple times on YouTube? It's because people have been profiting from this division for a long, long time. This was the formal legal creation of black and white, which were born from the embers of Bacon's rebellion. 1676, a dispute over land and authority sparked a conflict in the Virginia colony, leading to an insurrection that we now call Bacon's Rebellion. But beneath the surface of this power struggle lay the seeds of a far-reaching transformation about.
Now, just to give a little more context, Bacon was considered not so much establishment. He might have been, depending on what he did for work. However, he was certainly a colonist from Europe who came over and was supposed to be given land on the outskirts of the colony. Why is that important? The outskirts of the colony was technically the borderland between the colonists and the native aboriginals that were already here. That was, we gave, if I remove myself from it, the ancestors of the natives and aboriginals, after fighting or peaceful transition, say, okay, take this land. You guys are here, you got it, cool. That doesn't mean people stop fighting for more resources. Land is a resource. Trees are a resource. Grass, soil, wildlife that has yet to be discovered by other groups of people can be a resource, right? So bodies of water, streams, tributaries, lakes, ponds, all of that is considered a resource to somebody, especially in the right hands. So this is a little bit more context as to what is going on here.
About how society would come to see and segregate herself. So imagine standing on the shores of Virginia, your eyes looking along the open East Coast. It's not just any land. This is some of the best land. It's the cream of the crop. And most of it has already been snapped up by some of the big aristocrats of the day. And these lands had seen a lot of growth, a lot of prosperity.
I knew I was underwater. I just didn't.
There's a lot of money there, thanks in part to the peace of Pocahontas, partly through the aftermath of the Second Powhatan War. The aristocrats had a really cushy, nice territory for themselves carved out. And sometimes
See, and this is where I mentioned you have to study the languages and even the etymology of words from prior times. We don't even say aristocrats anymore, but we say elites. The aristocrats and the elites are the same group of people. It's just modern day, modern time. Colloquialism changes.
Sometimes they would sell bits of their territory to newcomers who were coming in, who were also considered elite. So into this scene steps a newcomer, William Berkeley. He is a man fresh from the court of Charles I in England. He was knighted for his work and his loyalty. He was also a man with a lot of connections. He was appointed as the governor of Virginia in the Virginia colonies in 1641, where he very quickly set up shop with his own plantation near Jamestown.
Now, mind you, before she gets too into this, remember, in the last prior video, we just seen after 1609, there were already paper written laws preventing those of new melanated skin complexion and melanated skin complexion from interacting with each other. So now we're further in time at 1640 something, she said.
He was appointed as the governor of Virginia in the Virginia colonies in 1641.
1641. Okay, so there's already now years worth of practicing of the splitting of groups of people by skin complexion. So let's dive back into this.
Where he very quickly set up shop with his own plantation near Jamestown, fitting right in with the elite. But Berkeley wasn't just about planting crops. He led a decisive attack against the Powhatan Nation, bringing an end to the Third Powhatan War. Now, the peace treaty, basically, it granted him and his buddies a lucrative monopoly on the deerskin and fur trade. Nathaniel Bacon steps in. He wants to keep pushing out into the indigenous land. There's more land. You have these aristocrats who...
And what did we just say? Resources. Animals are a resource. Deerskin is a resource. Moccasins. The fur inside of a moccasin. Suede, leather in itself. We still make leather clothes today. That is a resource. Alright? Our ancestors and elders of yesterday were no slouches. It's not that they weren't intelligent. They knew what they were doing. It's just as time goes on, we naturally become lazy to things. So let's get back into this.
Basically have all the good land, and Nathaniel Bacon is well off, but he's not as well off as these guys, and he's thinking, if I could just push out west a little bit, we could have a plantation for ourselves. We could have land. He kind of riles up the lower class of people, and this lower class were considered lower class not based on skin color, because this was a mix of people who would later be considered white and black, but it was, again, based on class in the truest sense of the word. And he wants to push out into these territories. Governor Berkeley says, no, like, we're not going to do that. I want to maintain the trade with the Native Americans. And we might look at Governor Berkeley and say, oh, he's a good guy. He is protecting indigenous people. He doesn't want to push into their land. But that's not really the case. This is a self-serving move. It's a self-righteous move, because he could say, well, I don't want to push into that territory. We're not going to give you military protection and power to do that, because I want to keep these treaties that I've got going. He's got all these deals happening for him and his friends on the side. Well, Nathaniel Bacon wants a piece of the pie. And this is how it always goes, because the truth...
She's absolutely right. This is how it always goes. This is year 2025 now. What are we experiencing? A war between the conservatives and the liberal elites. We now have a conservative that's in office that's in here saying, hey, we need to get back to conservative values. Well, we just had a party of liberals that were saying, hey, we want to keep being more liberal. Let's let more people in. You see how all this is starting to play out? There's context to this, and this is where you start getting the cliches of there's nothing new around the sun, and everything comes back around full circle. But again, I don't want to stop this. This is pretty lengthy as is. I'm super grateful that you guys are rocking out with me. Shameless plug. Again, tap into the Instagram at the b.o.m.experience. Send me DMs, send me emails, likes, comments on the YouTube page. Ask me questions. Email me videos that you would like for me to react to. Again, give my opinion, observation, and analysis on. Again, super grateful. I am enjoying this to the max. Let's get back into this.
True division is really not about color. It is about money and power. Nathaniel Bacon was described as charismatic and courageous, and he was supposed to represent the disenfranchised. And he rallied support for his cause against the colonial government and its refusal to support westward expansion. And so, in defiance, Bacon and a group of colonists launched attacks against the Native American communities in 1676, leading Berkeley to label him a traitor. So this conflict escalates until Bacon takes control of Jamestown. And so Nathaniel Bacon ends up burning Jamestown.
Advertisements. Like 5 seconds. All right.
And so Nathaniel Bacon ends up burning Jamestown with his militia, with his group. He ends up getting like a fever or dysentery or something, and he dies just a couple weeks later, and the revolt is squashed. But now the Virginia elite are realizing something. They're realizing that this class of people who they had written off as just worthless were actually able to band together and be heard and be people of action. And this terrified the elite. They were so scared of this happening again that they realized they had to create a way to divide these people even further. So now you have the class distinction, and now we're going to divide by color. Here, in the wake of
Now, I also want to add this in. When I speak to my peers that may be coming from other nations, my entire life I've been super grateful to have interacted with people that come from other nations, other bodies of land. Um, and people, which I'm grateful for, have asked the tough questions. Why do black people get hung up on color so much? And it's when you don't understand the history, you end up asking those questions. Um, and then when you know parts of the history, but only shallow parts, you limit yourself, not understanding how much power you truly have. But to respond to those that are wise enough to ask those questions and genuinely ask, not with negative intent, I respond to them. It's a color class system where you have people in other nations that have just a class system, or they have an intellectual class system where you're not just divided upon resources, you're also divided upon your level of schooling, right? We're going to get into that later on. You know, there are just more and more ways to divide people. There will always be ways to divide people, but it's up to the people to determine whether they want to be divided or not. If they want to be above that and stand for something that isn't, as prominent as some want them to be made to believe. But let's get back into this. This is great. Super. Again, I appreciate y'all.
this conflict, colonial leaders began to draw lines that had not existed before. Ability to vote and partake in any kind of governance, to have a say in what's going on, was tied to land ownership. So this further marginalized who was able to participate. If you were poor or you didn't have land for whatever reason, you didn't get a say in what was going on. The rebellion stands out for its unprecedented coalition of black and white indentured servants and slaves, along with African slaves, who were all united in opposition to colonial authority.
Now, take very important note. She said black, white, and also African. There's the reason why we have terms like black, African American, and things of that nature is because politically during that time, and this was also put on paper as well, when you want to blend in certain things, you have to change how you identify. So imagine, right, you have North American black tarantula spiders that are native to North America, but you bring over African black tarantula spiders into North America. After a while, you're just going to call them all black tarantula spiders, but there might be a major difference. The North American black tarantula spiders might not be as big. They might have larger sections, or the African tarantula spider might have different behavioral patterns that have been entwined and encoded into his DNA that takes hundreds of years, maybe even thousands, possibly even millions of years to actually invoke a true, genuine change on. Not just an epigenetic change, but a true, genuine DNA-coded change. You can have an epigenetic change where you have certain environmental factors play on, and it may change the genetic expression for a generation, 2, or even possibly 3. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be the forever change. Now, with all the information, communication technology that we have, we see now that there were always people here in the North Americas, South Americas, that were of melanated color already. We also now know, when you look at the numbers and do the math, no matter what sites you go to, if you do the math correctly, it's not possible for the numbers of people that were actually brought over when you account for the actual shipping ledgers and accounting ledgers, because remember, the Africans that were brought over here were considered livestock. So you took a very accurate report of that, especially when you lost your stock. You're running a business. When you do the math on it and then you account for immigration and the death toll and whatnot, you still don't reach the number of millions of people of melanated expression that's here in North America right now. So we also learned that a lot of the Atlantic slave trade wasn't from Africa over to the Americas. Majority of it took place from North America to South America and South America to North America. Don't get me wrong, you've had your slaves that came over or your indentured servants that came over from Africa. Yes, that is very true. However, the vast majority of that was just a interchanging of uh, of male and men from the North American continent to the Southern American continent. Now, to also throw in some more information of context, during this time prior to this, they weren't doing servitude based off of color. That is a new practice for them by this time, by the 1700s. So we could say, what, about 60, 80 years tops where this is a new practice. So that means that there were people of color already there that were not considered servants, that were actually functioning in society, giving back, working in what was their economy of the time.
Often we want to say, well, who is the good guy in this and who is the bad guy? And really, that's not always how life works. In response to the perceived threat of a unified front of indentured servants and slaves, colonial authorities began to implement laws that formalized racial distinctions. So this is where history gets really tough and it gets really nuanced. And it's hard to grapple with because on one hand, I would look at this and say, well, Bacon was totally wrong. Like, we shouldn't, the way he wanted to treat the indigenous people here, we totally disagree with. So on one hand, we can agree with that. But on the other hand, he was able to round up this militia, not based on color, but by class. And you have all of these people who are feeling disenfranchised and not heard. It's really hard to break this into, well, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys? After they crushed this revolt, it marked the beginning of legally enforced racial segregation and slavery.
See, so to bring it back full circle, this is where I want to throw in. Right before the integration of legal slavery, you now have this, again, you have Bacon was wrong for wanting to expand into the Native American territory, but then you also have the people that were of a lower class system saying, hey, we're not getting our fair share. This is that snowball effect. Do you just want to go out into the territory and take it, and now you're going against an entire treaty, and now you have to deal with the consequences of an exploded snowball directly impacting you? Or do you try to guide it in another manner? And now we got to have a level of compassion because at that time, we don't know the actual nuance, life circumstances and decisions that had to be made. We don't know during that time if in a hypothetical situation, there was a shortage on toilet paper, right? We just had COVID not too long ago. Stores were running short on toilet paper. COVID, right? That could have pushed certain things. There were a lot of nuances that we don't have, so we're trying to look back. But when you see, when you see these grand implementations, you then can actually sit back and say, well, this wasn't a good thing. That certainly wasn't a good thing. But now you also have the cat chasing its tail in some form of retrospect, because again, that snowball is already rolling. It's inevitable that it's going to go somewhere. The question is it going to go directly to a destination and explode without any care, or is it going to go to another destination with some care and it might not explode at all? But clearly we've seen throughout time it exploded into something else.
So following Bacon's rebellion in 1676, everything shifted. Everything changed. Sometimes you might have these moments in life, I know I definitely have, where I'm like, I look at this date and I'm like, after this date, things totally changed. It was everything before that date, everything after that date. And we can look at Bacon's rebellion that way. The aftermath of the uprising saw a significant transformation on how the colony's laws addressed race and servitude. So we need to get back to that servitude part, underscoring a deliberate move towards the codification of color and racial distinctions in a legal framework.
You see this house in Florida? Well, let me show you how
would eventually evolve into the institution of slavery in America. In the years immediately following the rebellion, Virginia's legislature began to enact a series of regulations known as the Black Codes. These laws curtailed the freedoms of Africans and their descendants, starkly delineating rights and privileges based on racial lines. And by 1680, only 4 years after Bacon's Rebellion, a pivotal law was passed prohibiting what was now called blacks, both free and enslaved, from bearing arms. So this is not just an issue of we are even further separating those who are indentured servants or those who are considered a slave. We are saying if you are considered black, you cannot have a gun. You cannot protect yourself. And this has nothing to do with class anymore. Now it has to do with color, because they weren't able to separate this based on class. It wasn't working. This legislation also forbade the assembly of large groups of blacks, as they put it, a clear attempt to thwart any potential for collective action or rebellion. Furthermore, it mandated severe punishment for slaves who dared to assault Christians or attempt escape. And so now
This is important. I want to add this context in. When they put on paper, these are now the laws that affects blacks. That's intentional, because yes, you have your slaves and your slave descendants that came over from Africa, but they look just like the natives that were here, the Aboriginals that were here. Even when you look at the Australian Aboriginals, they look like they're descendants from Africa as well, or they're even close relatives to Africa, or relatives from Africa. So now that also says, well, hey, according to our law, you don't have rights. Let's go to war again. Let's further out and further expand. All right. So, and then when you end up getting into 1890s, you end up getting the Curtis Act. There's an intentional major setback for now a specific classing or grouping of people.
How the hierarchy is changing. It's going from a class system, are you a landowner or are you not, to a color system. Now, as these laws proliferated, Virginia declared in 1682 that all imported black servants would be enslaved for life. This is a 180 on what was happening before. So before, you were considered, for the most part, an indentured servant, and there was, at least in theory, the possibility of freedom. And we won't get into all of that in this video, but I would like to touch on that. But this period also saw New York, who was following Virginia's lead, making it illegal for enslaved people to sell goods in 1684, so further restricting the economy of those people who are called black. The introduction of these black codes and the subsequent slave laws, and I'm going to say slave laws because that's what they were called at the time, represented a seismic shift towards a society that was now organized starkly along color and racial lines. These laws were reflective of the colonial authorities' fears of a united front among people who were disenfranchised, and it laid the foundation for that system of chattel slavery, which we're coming back to that now. So before, depending on the circumstances you were born into or whether or not you were considered an indentured servant, there was this possibility of freedom. Not anymore. Now, you were deemed, your status was set for life based on your mother's condition. So if your mother was enslaved, you'll be enslaved. This legal framework sanctioned the enslavers' rights to control, abuse, kill those that they enslaved. And
see, so now you end up getting a cyclical behavior pattern of what was already being practiced in Europe, which we had already seen in the prior video, how Europeans were already enslaving Europeans, and even Africans enslaving Africans. And I wouldn't doubt that took place in the Americas whatsoever. However, the intent behind it might have been way different. We don't necessarily know to a degree, but what we do know is documentation-wise, when it comes to ancient European practice, it was not pretty amongst its own people. And if there were wars that took place between nations ancient African, ancient Asian cultures and people, more than likely it was due to a behavior being practiced that majority people weren't in agreement with. So let's get back into this. About 3 more minutes. I think this is pretty good. Super appreciative. I appreciate y'all for rocking. I'm super grateful.
There were ripple effects for this that we know. The rebellion had dire consequences for the Native Americans who were already here. They were caught between the colonial settlers and the colonial government, and the destruction of villages by Bacon's forces exemplifies the violence that was inflicted on these populations. So it's very difficult to look at Bacon's rebellion and come out feeling good on the other side, to say either the good guy won or the bad guy lost or whatever, because in many ways, everyone stinks in this situation. Everyone's terrible in this situation. I'm not surprised that it's not often covered in history courses because it's super complex and there's even more nuance to this. I mean, this is just like the 101 version on it. This transcends, I think, just a mere power struggle, which on some level it looks like it's just a power struggle between two rich British guys. You know, in the rebellion's wake, though, the landscape of Virginia was forever altered. There was a fear that gripped the elite. They were afraid that at any point now, this lower class of people who couldn't vote and didn't count could band together and make their will known. And so the aftermath of this story is one of division and distinction. And the unity that existed between the indentured servants of across color lines and racial lines was shattered by a deliberate legal and social reform. This is difficult. This is a very difficult topic, and I think it needs more than one video. But I think the biggest takeaway is that the work to separate you and me by color is on purpose. It was strategic.
She is absolutely right. It was strategic. It was on purpose. It was very intentional. We could see it just how the laws were implemented. And again, if you're just working off the idea that your elders and your ancestors were at least as smart, if not smarter than what we are today, we're not going to sit here and say our elders and ancestors were dumb. We can't say that. It's not possible, right? So if we're going to say that they were as smart, if not smarter, and we see the diabolical things that people do today, how could you not say it wasn't intentional? How could you not say it wasn't done on purpose? How could you not say someone didn't have the foresight or the intellect or knowledge to understand that this would be able to create certain outcomes for the benefit of others? Yeah, this was great. Super duper appreciative. I'm glad y'all rocked out with me. I certainly want to do more of this. I got some more videos coming, some more prior information that will be needed. This is all up here, free for you. That call this like free schooling after a certain point. I'm telling you, I might have to start charging for all this stuff, especially if I'm going to be doubling back on information. But it's here now. So, and I do this so I can be able to say, now that you have this information, how are you going to go about life now? I know it's still early to think about that, but I'm posing it now so it's in your mind, so you can sit there and say, how do I want to go about life, knowing that this is how things were done? Do I want to keep taking the same path? Do I want to be better than those that were here before me? How, a lot was done just for me to be here today. How much greater can I truly be? I think these are great questions for somebody to ask themselves. And again, it's no rush. It's no rush. As much as we try to rush things on this planet, being your best self starts with one step at a time. You gotta crawl before you can walk, and once you're walking, you can only put one foot in front of the other. So, with that said, I am here on YouTube, Instagram as well at the.o.m.experience. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Content creators will be in the description. Email me videos that you would like for me to react to. If you have any questions, comments, email me, DM me. I am open to it as of right now. This was fun. And you know what? Ciao.